Thank you, Russell. Good evening to you all. I'm a little uneasy that some of you are standing. Can you find at least a perch? I hope so. But first I would like to thank you for the very warm welcome. I'm going to show you in a minute how I think about the sponsorship of this lecture in terms of framing what I'm going to say. But thank you to the Centre and to the Cardiff Centre for Law and Religion and the District Branch of the United Nations and the Welsh Centre for International Affairs. This is very generous. So thank you very, very much. I'm delighted to be here, but a little ashamed at the same time because I am not a specialist in Islam, and I suspect almost everybody else in the room is. So any questions that are directed to me on Islam will be quickly deflected to the many specialists here. But what I do want to talk about is how the debate about Islam is contextualized, how it came to happen, how Islam grew in this country, and the kind of questions that are posed because of this community, and what that community, how that has provoked the social sciences to think differently, or in some cases to fail to do so. This is the kind of thing I want to share with you. So let's get started. And I am thinking first about the sponsorship of this lecture, because we begin with the Islamic community. I want to think particularly about legal issues in the centre part of my lecture. And when we get to the United Nations Association and the Welsh Centre for International Affairs, I'm very aware that we're coming out of academia and we're talking about real life, which is how I like it. That this is about impact, this is about policy making. It's not simply about the lecture theatre. And I guess Cardiff University, I don't know specifically what they did, but that would be all of the above, wouldn't it? And I'm going to work out a little bit how to draw these threads together in the next hour or so. I'm going to take a threefold approach. The first part of my lecture will really look at the factors to take into account when we are understanding the religious situation in this country, in Britain, and the place of Islam in it. This is not, as it were, random. We can work through some of these factors which give us a clue about how to think about the community and the questions that are posed by it. And in the second part of my lecture, I'm going to look at new fields of study that are emerging in this context and the reasons for these new fields of study. This is not a static situation at all. But at the end, I'm coming back to public debate. The goal for me, what I really want to contribute to, is a more constructive debate about what I consider to be issues of extreme importance to the democratic future of this and indeed other countries. If we cannot accommodate religious diversity, there is something seriously wrong with our democracy. And that, I think, is the really central question that I want to pose. And so let us get going straight away and think about the factors to take into account when we're understanding first the community, the religious situation, and then the place of Islam within it. Okay, Susie. Now, Russell, in his overgenerous introduction, talked about books I had published, and I'm framing a little bit what I'm going to say now between the early book on religion in Britain since 1945, which did have the subtitle Believing Without Belonging, which then, as it were, found it a whole niche or a whole set of applications, some of them more appropriate than others. And 20 years later, which is rather slow, I came back to this, and technically as a second edition, the new book was published. This is called Religion in Britain, A Persistent Paradox. And the paradox is really what I'm going to be working on. Okay. But I was faced with a kind of dilemma. Most people do their second editions rather sooner than 20 years. And the catalogue of excuses sounds like, students whose essays are late. So we won't go into them. But I was quite challenged by this. Could I fit the new data into the framework that I created in 1994? And it was pretty soon I had to admit that I could not do this. There were three reasons, really, why so much had changed. The situation in Britain had changed markedly. The amount of data had escalated. There's hugely more material on religion than there was 20 years ago, which is a point I'm going to return to. And the other thing, of course, that had changed was me. In 20 years as a scholar, you don't stay the same person. And what I had done, particularly in that time, was to travel. And so I became much, much more aware of what my own country was not, as well as what it was. So, I mean, if any younger, almost everybody is younger than me now, a person comes to me and says, shall I travel? I would always say yes, because you will learn so much about your own country by leaving it. But how should I proceed? If I was going to abandon believing without belonging, what was I going to do? And what I did do was to develop something that I had worked on, in fact, over a number of years, about a decade, which was these factors that you need to take into account if you're really going to understand religion in Britain and indeed in Europe. And there are 5 of these, which we're going to unpack very rapidly. Some of you might have heard me do this before, and I do apologize, but I've tried awfully hard to think of a different way of doing it. It never works so well. So I come back, and it's necessary to frame what I'm going to say next. The really important point to grasp is that these factors push and pull in different directions. This begins to reveal the complexity of the situation in this country, and the pressures not only, but also on the Muslim community. You can see how the thing is being pushed and pulled in different directions. And one of the reasons why the media accounts are frequently so, I think, inadequate is because they do not see all the factors. They tend to see one and draw it out and overemphasize it. And the ones that get drawn out, of course, are we either are becoming increasingly secular and there's no other story, or we're being overrun by Islam. The two are not compatible, of course, but that's how the media story comes, and we've got to do better. We've got to do better. So let's have a look at what I want to draw to your attention. I want to say that our cultural heritage cannot be understood if you do not take the Judeo-Christian tradition seriously. It's not the only background factor. Greek rationalism and Roman organization are also central, but we can't talk about everything tonight. And just to pinpoint that for you, think about time and space. Weeks, weekends, festivals, the framing of the year is modeled on Christian time. Sunday is no longer a day of worship for most people, but it is a different day. And as soon as you bring other communities into this country, of course, you begin to realize the significance of this, because Christians or people who have no faith are fine with Monday to Fridays and do something else different at the weekend, including, if they wish, go to a place of worship. But other faith communities work on a different rhythm. And then that already sets up a series of debates in the workplace and the legal issues that come with that. And space. Our skyline is becoming more diverse. We do have a number of buildings from many different faith communities, but it's not usually easy to place those in the centres of older cities in this country. You will cause consternation if you try to do that. There is a givenness about our expectation in terms of how we consider a city, and often this does not resonate until it's challenged, but it's very present. Russell very kindly mentioned this term, vicarious religion. The notion that there is a form of religious organization all over Europe, it's not only in this country, which works essentially like a public utility. It's there at the point of need for anybody who wishes to take up the services of the established church in this country. And that still exists. It's strong in Greece, it's relatively strong in the Nordic countries because they are wealthy churches. It's relatively weak here, weak in Scotland, weak in France, but strong in Italy. You could go around Europe thinking in those terms. But public utilities are very expensive. It's just like the health service. This is probably non-viable, but a lot of the habit associated with it is still in our consciousness, at least if you are probably 50 or plus, maybe 60 now. I sense this, my children do not. That is fading. That is the story of secularization. That is eroding pretty fast in this country. But over it, over the public utility, is growing a market. All kinds of religion is flourishing. It's not going to replace the public utility, but it is going to, as it were, emerge in new ways. And the interesting thing in this respect is that the kinds of religion that are doing well, relatively speaking, I know that begs a lot of questions, but just take it like that for the moment, are not the ones we thought would be doing well when I first learnt my sociology. It is the case that conservative and emotional religions do better than liberal ones. And the experiential does better than cerebral. The two winners in our market, if you would pardon that phrase, are charismatic evangelical churches and cathedrals. They're very different, but they do share certain qualities, which is an element of experience. We can develop that later if you want to. But it's into this situation, as it were, an emergent market over the top of a public utility, that many new arrivals come to Britain, or to France, or to Germany. Now, their provenance depends on history, largely, but the market is extending to include other faith communities, brought by migration, largely. We'll look at that in a minute. As it were, creating a situation where we are becoming, at one and the same time, both more secular and more diverse. And we need to take both into account. I'm going to pick up the new arrivals in more detail in a minute. I just want to remind you that there are increasing numbers of secular alternatives. So not only does religion become a chosen category, so too do different versions of the secular. Not all of them are as extreme as new atheism, though that is one among others, a small minority, but a noisy one. And of course we have to remember, and this will reappear, that all this is taking place not in a vacuum, but against a set of global trends which are entirely different from the European ones. Europe is becoming more secular and more diverse. There is very little sign in the rest of the world that religion is diminishing in any way at all. The world is as furiously religious as ever. So there's your very quick background. And let's now look a little bit more detail at the new arrivals, who come in waves. You'll know this story much better than I do. Expanding economies in the 60s and 70s brought new communities into the big economies of Europe: France, Britain, Germany, West Germany then, and the Netherlands. In the 1990s, as it were, it changes because the countries of Southern Europe, of Mediterranean Europe, and of Nordic Europe, which in the 60s, 50s and 60s were still, of course, countries of emigration, turn around extremely fast. And so Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, the Nordic countries, and think of Ireland as a classic example. Ireland flicks extraordinarily fast from being a country of emigration to a country of immigration. 1990s Dublin was hip, expensive, fun, cosmopolitan, totally different from the Ireland of the mid-20th century. And then it all crashed in 2008. Very rapid changes going on. In 2004, migration begins to take a different, as it were, turn, because in 2004, the European Union extends, and then you begin to get migration from East Central Europe into the West. And that's, as it were, lying over the earlier immigrations. And if you like, last year and this, we've become accustomed to the phrase, the migrant crisis, the current crisis. I'm not sure that that's a good one. But again, the whole discourse about migration and new arrivals is changing. It's absolutely at the top of the political agenda. It's not dealt with well. That's one reason why we need a better discourse about religion. But this is where we are at. I would ask one thing. I say this wherever I go and to whoever it is I lecture to, how important it is that the facts and figures are accurate. So much in the media rests on distortion, which is a bad start to any debate, healthy debate about religion, is to distort the figures. So, you are all in places where you can make a difference in this way. Be accurate, make sure everybody else is accurate, and challenge when you know it is wrong. We have an obligation, I think, to challenge what we hear. One of my tests is, I don't know that I dare do it myself, but I still suggest it. Would you have the courage to pick up the phone to join a phone-in your local radio when somebody has said something manifestly wrong or inaccurate? Could you do it, put it right, speak well about your faith community, graciously, in order to foster healthy debate? I think that's a good question to ask of yourselves and your students. It's simple, but it makes a difference. Okay. And here we begin to get really to the significance of Islam, because what I feel is so essential to grasp, and I personally think this is a good thing. I think this is a really positive contribution made by this community, maybe not always intentionally, but the arrival of Islam, remember, from a different cultural background from the one that I started with, has reopened the debate about religion and public life. This is the reason why we are in this paradox that I'm talking about, which is that we become more secular, but we talk more about religion. This is the situation we're in. We are more secular. Nothing has turned around in this country. It's not a story of desecularization or even the post-secular, though that's a little bit more controversial. But there is absolutely no doubt that public debate centers on religion in a way that 20, 30 years ago, this did not happen. Islam is the catalyst. And that's not a bad thing. This is a debate that we should have. But our debate, our British debate, is very different from the French debate. We've got to contextualize our debate in the British tradition. When I work with my French colleagues, you don't wait long in France before they are driving back to a principle. They're always looking for a principle. The principle that they normally produce or emerges very quickly in these conversations is the principle of laïcité, which is a French word. It doesn't translate well. It means the absence of religion in the public sphere. And they will always go back to this if they're trying to make a point about schools or the state or whatever. When I intervene, I look for a solution. This is pragmatism. It's a much more pragmatic debate in this country. And we simply talk in different ways. We're formed by different literatures. We're formed by different educational systems. And you have to make a big imaginative leap to communicate well with French scholars in this field. Think of the Dutch. They're trying hard too, and the Dutch are very interesting because they've almost always been head of the pack in terms of liberal values, in the acceptance, for example, of same-sex relationships, in soft drugs, all kinds of things you can think. The Dutch were always there first. But they have a strange way of protecting liberalism, which is to exclude anybody who does not share liberal values. And I'm puzzled that you can protect liberalism by being illiberal. It seems to me that you are undermining, you're cutting off the branch you're sitting on. Or if you want to put it in nice Dutch terms, tulips don't look nice with barbed wire around them. You know, you're protecting your garden, but with a rather nasty barrier around it. The Danish cartoons, the Swiss minarets, remember the Archbishop of Canterbury in Sharia law. There's a very interesting Swedish doctoral thesis which is quite close to that debate. A whole set of issues are showing us that we're having difficulty with the debate in public life. Where does this religious community, where does Islam lie in our societies? We're discomforted. Public and private are no longer in the way that we assume they would be. And now I do want to add the, as it were, the background questions. And here I focus on 3 dates. 79 is the Iranian Revolution. 89 is the fall of communism. 9/11, I think I don't need to tell you what that is. The thing that is so interesting to me about these dates is that they are world-changing events, absolutely world-changing events. They are the pivotal events of the late 20th century. And not one of us, scholar, pundit, policymaker, politician, not one of us saw them coming. Now, how did that happen? Now, I would be absolutely wrong to say that they are unequivocally religious events. But I do think there's an important religious element in all of them. Religion emerged as a powerful motivator of events that we didn't expect. But we didn't expect that to happen. We simply had sidelined religion from the debate and were taken by surprise 3 times. Now, how many more times, one could say? And I want to show you a book now, which I find totally fascinating. Do any of you know it? Now, I find that fascinating too. It's not so widely quoted. It's not an academic book. Well, it is. I mean, it gives a lot of thought to academia for academics. But it's not. It's a trade book, if you like, if you want to use those terms. And it's called Strange Rebels, and the two strange rebels are the market and religion, which the author argues, retrospectively, nobody saw it at the time, that in 1979 marks the ascendance of the market and of religion over the state and the secular in global terms. And you can see by the picture the kind of examples. Here's Mrs. Thatcher, of course she came to power in 79. The Ayatollah, same. Deng Xiaoping in China, that's when the market begins to open up in China. And then you have got the first war in Afghanistan, and you have got the election of John Paul II. And what the book does is weave a narrative that brings all of those factors together. And what you see, in fact, is huge pressure on the Soviet Union, both in terms of religion as opposed to secularism, and in terms of the market pushing on the state. And I find that totally fascinating. And that is the backdrop. 1979 becomes the pivotal year when the whole, as it were, if you think of the narratives of the mid-20th century, the secular state is the core concept. And is it adequate for our debates currently? I think that's very provocative. And that's the background to the book that I was writing on Britain, which is only a tiny corner of the world, if you like. But this is the paradox. I've already mentioned it. The process of secularization continues, but the growing prominence of religion in public discussion against the global background that I've just described. But we're in trouble. We're in trouble. Now, why are we in trouble? Because at precisely the moment when they're most needed, British people are losing the vocabulary, tools, and concepts that they require in order to have a constructive conversation about faith. The process of secularization erodes the vocabulary that we now need. Where are we going to put it back? How are we going to get this back? That's one of the things I want to tackle. Now, religious education is clearly one place, and we are talking seriously about religious education. We've inherited a wonderfully pragmatic situation whereby this subject is at one and the same time core curriculum. It has to be there, but it is also voluntary. You can withdraw your child. Now, who else could have thought but the British could have made up something which is both compulsory and you can withdraw your child? I mean, you try explaining that to the French and they really just don't get it. But we've got to think about that. But partly because of the sponsorship of this lecture, I'm going to go in a slightly different direction. So we're going to new fields of study and then straight into the next one, okay? This I'm taking from chapter 10 in The New Religion in Britain. And this is about religion in public life. It's the chapter that deals with religion in public life. And it recognizes the step change in the field. And one of the things that's happened as we begin to talk more about religion, and of course we're talking more because we are disconcerted by religion, we've moved from it being not there to it being a problem. And when there's a problem, one thing you do is research. If you look at track research money, there's always a story behind it. So in my view, the right thing has happened for the wrong reason. The wrong reason, I think, is a fear of religion, and if I may say so, often a fear of Islam. But what has been generated is an enormous amount of religion in the field, research in the field, I beg your pardon. And let's go with that. Right thing done for the wrong reason is better than the wrong thing done for the right reason. So let's just accept that we have generated the data and work with it. So what has happened right across Europe, it's not only in this country, a series of what I call research programs. And I use that word carefully. These are not projects. These are not one-off, as it were, efforts to solve this problem or that problem. It's much, much more systematic. There's a lot more joined-up thinking. And you remember the Religion and Society Research Programme in this country. I mean, Sophie, who's not here tonight, which for me is a great sadness, got a lot of money from that programme to do fine work on Islam in this country. There were many others as well, but there's a similar programme in Sweden, in Denmark, in Switzerland, and the European Commission itself funded a great deal of work in this respect. And in the book, I look at this under 4 headings. I mean, there could have been 14 headings, but I look at religion and law, which is in a minute going to figure in this presentation, religion and politics, and religion and welfare, and religion and healthcare. Okay, and because I know more about religion and welfare and healthcare than I do about the law, I'm just going to tuck this in. I was part of 2 very big comparative projects on religion and welfare, and I'm not going to tell you all about them, except that the whole debate here is a slightly different driver. It's driven by two things: financial constraint, we don't have the money we used to, and demographic change. We live much longer than our parents and grandparents. So who is going to look after us all? This has provoked a big debate, because the notion of the welfare state, which is very developed in European post-war thinking, the notion that you can deliver from the cradle to the grave, which is a very interesting moving of language from religion into the secular sphere, the wheels come off because we cannot afford it. And so we're driven back to the question, who will do it? And as religion comes back into the welfare debate, all kinds of questions arise about the appropriateness of this, and is this the right thing to do? And Europeans, we discovered, are wonderfully pragmatic. It would indeed be better if the state could look after us from the cradle to the grave, but we know they can't, so it's better that somebody does it than nobody. But there's a lot of thinking that religion is appropriate in some fields, not in others. I've just read an extraordinarily interesting thesis on food banks. They don't call them food banks. Facilities to distribute food in Finland. Now, Finland has one of the most comprehensive welfare states you can imagine. And very, very penetrating analysis of what's going on. For example, relating the distribution of food through food banks to a justification of excess. That we in fact have too much, but this legitimates excess if it can be used charitably. All kinds of interesting things that I simply had not thought of before. But one of the questions that is central in the whole debate about welfare is entitlement. And then we go back to migration, because the challenge to, who can or can't have welfare is absolutely central to the English debate. It's not an edifying one, but it is what people think about. How do we decide who merits benefit from the welfare state and who does not? On what grounds do you do it? So you're back into the same issues. Religion and healthcare are, again, just totally fascinating. One of the centres of this debate is mental health, because migrants come into the West. If they're asylum seekers, they're often very damaged. They are referred to mental health care, and they present with a religious narrative, because that is what they do. That is how they think about themselves. And the Western clinician is perplexed. How do I deal with this? And there's a very interesting body of material in the, on the website of the Royal College of Psychiatry, which is hardly alternative medicine, if it's the Royal College. It's all about the place of religion and spirituality and secularism in mental health care, in psychiatry. And what the debate about now is not simply assuming that religion is delusional, but discerning the difference between healthy religion and toxic religion. And that's a completely different skill, which Western clinicians have got to learn, and learn fast, because they're going to need it. And the last example I just want to give you on this is a wonderful set of articles in The Lancet, which is about faith-based healthcare in the developing world. Now, this didn't tell me anything that I didn't know, to be honest. It's about the real importance of partnering with religious providers if you are going to make an effective difference, if the secular state is as it were, dodgy, one could say, and if the economy is fragile. The place where you will deliver is through a religious provider, through those networks, even if you may be discomforted by some of the teaching. This is the really tricky thing. But if you look at the detail, for example, in the Ebola crisis, where the only thing that made a difference was radical change in the care of the dying, it had to be the world faiths, particularly Islam and Christianity, who persuaded people that you set aside normal practice and you buried the body without touching it. And this was an enormous attitude, habit change, which only the faith communities could deliver. And as I say, I didn't know all that detail, but the fact that the Lancet published it really, for me, was very striking. This is the premier biomedical journal in this country. But let's press on to religion and the law. I want to pay tribute here to the Cardiff Centre for Law and Religion. It's the oldest in the country. It was, Russell paid me the compliment of I was sort of on the money pretty soon. So were they. They work with the theory and practice of substantive law concerning religion, both with religious law and national and international law affecting religion. That's growing. That's a real centre of discussion and debate, and it's very good. I look at their website from time to time and to see it flourishing. And next week, it is next week, is that right? Next month. Yeah, next month. The Cardiff Festival of Law and Religion will take place, celebrating the 25th anniversary of the LLM in canon law, the first degree of its type in British universities since the Reformation. Now, that's a big claim. I'm delighted that it's honouring the work of Norman Doe. I know Norman Doe is not here tonight, but I would like to add my greetings to Norman on this very significant moment. He's done a huge amount of work in this field out of a legal background. I mean, very different from mine, but I find this very interesting. So please pass on those greetings, Russell. Russell is a co-editor of a very impressive Festschrift. I would like to give you two more examples, which I have worked on myself. The first is the Religare Project. This was a European-wide project. It was funded by the European Commission. It's a good example of the Commission putting money into this kind of thinking and empirical research. Interdisciplinary, we're finding this more and more, in the area of religious pluralism in Europe, examining new normative frameworks in the field of religion and secularism with a view to making policy recommendations. It's not ivory tower. The point is, what do we do? How do we manage diversity? What is acceptable? Where do the limits lie? On a whole set of really very difficult issues. Freedom of speech, that kind of thing. Are you free to say to you what you like? Can you simply offend the minorities who are living amongst us? Is this a sensible thing to do? Are the best frameworks legal, or is it much better to go for self-limitation, and how do you achieve that? And their final report was published under the title Belief, Law and Politics, What Future for Secular Europe? And this was not only the summary report, but it also has a whole series of papers which are reactions to this. So you can see a whole set of arguments. I find this a very interesting volume. Okay, and I was very flattered and delighted to be asked to write the foreword to this. I started by commending the interdisciplinarity and particularly the real attempts to bring law and social science together in the study of religion. And Russell knows this because we've talked about it in an earlier stage. The signs were not always so propitious. And I'll just give you two examples. Very early on, well back in the 90s, late 80s and 90s, there was a degree in Exeter in sociology and law, or law and society. Because we had a criminologist in our department, and we also had somebody who could teach the history of law, this kind of thing. I remember very, very well an examiner's meeting at the end of a year when a student on this joint degree had presented in his dissertation a social scientific discourse illustrated by legal cases. And an examiner wanted to rule those legal cases out of order in a sociological dissertation. I mean, the lack of imagination in that I thought was very striking. I can remember it, and the argument that I think that the poor lad passed, it was all right. But I mean, it was simply that you were still unable to accept that interdisciplinarity. And much more recently than that, in a university that will remain nameless and isn't even in this country, I had a good telling off for influencing a student of law to think sociologically. It was quite a dressing down, because for a legal student, for a student of law, legal analysis was paramount. Now, I do agree, but there are questions about why certain debates are happening now, which are social scientific. But we're doing much better. Russell's work is a wonderful example of the bringing together of law, sociology, and religion to a new discipline called law and religion. And I really do commend this. I recommend Russell's work to you very much. And in the foreword, I wanted to make this point. How do we balance attention to religion and thus the rights of religious people against those of other sections in the population, both small and large? Competing rights of all kinds, religious minorities, secular minorities, the rights of children, the rights of animals, if you're thinking of halal. These are balancing rights, and we need to think across the disciplines to have a positive and creative solutions. But more than this, the presence of religious minorities, notably Islam, challenges the mainstream. It challenges the notion that modern societies will be secular societies. The elision of modern and secular is now under review. And I'm going to come to that in my conclusion, but I want to give you one more example of religion and law. This is from a colleague in Greece, Effie Fokas, used to be a research assistant working with me. And it's one of these lovely progressions that you see in career. In a career, she's moved from being, a junior researcher to running her own project funded by the European Commission. Very proud to be, I think this is so commendable. Effie is the first Greek researcher to get a grant from the European Commission, one of these early career grants, not only to be Greek, but to hold the grant in Greece. There's lots of Greek people doing it in Paris at the LSE, here and there, or German universities, but she is in Greece. It's not easy doing work in Greece, I can tell you. But what she shows us in this extremely interesting project, which is to do with how European populations and polities, as it were, look at the Court of Human Rights and how they use the jurisprudence and the discourse in their own societies to promote or prevent certain kinds of argument. I mean, you can see how that happens in Britain, how bits of our media, bits of our politicians pick up the things they like or dislike from the European Court of Human Rights and exploit them, deploy them. Her case studies are, in fact, Romania, Greece, Italy, and Turkey, so that it's a different part of Europe. But it's very interesting. I do sit on the advisory board of her project. This is one of the most interesting things I do in my life now. I've retired. But to sit on the advisory board of one of these projects is just such a privilege, because you see the cutting edge work of extraordinarily able younger scholars, and you hear about it firsthand, but you don't actually have to do anything, but you do advise, you listen. And what has struck me again in this very, very interdisciplinary advisory board of senior scholars who really want to make this work, that we often fall into two conversations. That the lawyers, the legally trained people, are bringing one set of issues and the social scientists are bringing something different. And the real skill, of course, is to really get these to integrate fully and to get a discourse that really imaginatively overcomes these quite trenchant disciplinary boundaries. But there are new fields of study, like religion and welfare, and all those issues, like the healthcare issues, like mental health issues. These are new subfields, or even fields in their own right, where the training of different scholars and the need for collaboration, the need for imagination. The thing I think the social sciences, maybe the law is the same, lacks more than anything else is imagination. It often gets reduced to, we will do this because we know we can research it. It's neat and tidy. We can get good results, we can, as it were, defend them, we can defend them statistically and all the rest of it. But whenever was life neat and tidy? So we've got to do better. So let's come to a conclusion. My goal is a more constructive debate about issues of extreme importance to the democratic future of this country. This is high risk. If we get it wrong, we'll do damage. We've got to get it right. A robust democracy has to be able to deal with religious diversity. I feel that very sincerely. Okay, so what is the problem? The problem is very evident. It's an ill-informed and ill-mannered debate about delicate and difficult questions. They're not easy questions, which are central to a functioning democracy. One reason for this, one outcome really, is a growing concern about religious literacy. That's become a buzzword now. We're all looking for religious literacy around every corner. And what I think is the next step to take, and I'm beginning to stress this more and more, is that religious literacy is not one thing. You don't need the same kind of literacy to give appropriate care to an elderly person from a religious minority as you do to navigate as an ambassador around the Middle East or North Africa. They're both religious literacy. This, I think, is very relevant to the United Nations people and international relations who are present here and our hosts, that we really need to work out the literacies in our own fields. We need to work within different disciplines. Different disciplines attack this in different ways. And again, I think we need to think across our disciplines and societal sectors, which I have just mentioned. And just before Easter, I gave a series of lectures in Birmingham called the Cadbury Lectures, so no prizes for guessing where the money came from. And I called them Levelling the Ground. It was a bit of a play on words, because I was really looking for the responsibilities of social science to engage with these issues at every level of society, that local debate is very different from metropolitan debate in London, which is different again from national debate, which is different again from global debate. And I did a lecture on each of those. Interestingly, local debate is often healthier than national debate. Often, local journalists are much fairer to religion than national journalists. They know, as it were, the people they're writing about. It's much more personal. And you often find in local papers really good accounts of religious activities of many different kinds, and a pride in them. All kinds of practical things, all kinds of celebratory things, that kind of thing. And you don't have so much of what I might call the metropolitan elite, too clever by half, which can be very mocking of religion and very, very superior about it. You don't find that at local level, and I think that is worth saying. I know that lots of people in Cardiff learn journalism here. I hope they learn that local papers, local accounts are very valuable. That's the problem. let's look at the challenge. And here I'm moving much more back to my own discipline, or my own set of disciplines. Supposing, against the run of much European thinking, that it is not only possible but normal to be both fully modern and fully religious, how is European social science going to accommodate this fact? European social science grows out of Europe, unsurprisingly. It grows out of the European Enlightenment, and one very strong element of the European Enlightenment is to think that what Europe does today, everyone else will do tomorrow. It's arrogant and it's incorrect, but it's pervasive. If European social science is going to take the global religious situation seriously, and elements of that global situation who are now part of our own society, we're going to have to think hard. The disciplines that are currently engaged in that rest to a very considerable extent on an implicit elision between the modern, the secular, and the rational. That's what I learnt when I learnt social science. And I'm wondering if we really take religion seriously, will this adjustment require us to rethink the philosophies of science that underpin our activities? In other words, if social science really takes religion seriously, it's not just an add-on. It's just not a new field. It's going to do something to the core of social science, because that core is pervasively secular and rational. Can we deal with the less rational? And my last slide, which is the implications of that statement. I've half said it. Am I right, in other words, to argue that the serious study of religion cannot simply be added on to the social sciences as we currently know them? Rather, if taken to its logical conclusions, the turn to religion, and I've given you plenty of evidence for that in this country but in the world, it will disturb, at times radically, the foundations on which much of this edifice rests. Now, I've come quite a long way in my consideration of Islam in this country. I started by situating Islam in the wider, as it were, religious scene and explaining to you the complexities of that. I then looked to see how the Muslim minority, amongst others, but in this country it does tend to be Muslim, is making us think in new ways and creating or stimulating new fields of study, among them law and religion, welfare and religion, etc. I've now turned my question round, saying the serious study of Islam in this country is going to have a radical effect on social science if we do it well. Perhaps I've pushed my luck too far. I find this a fascinating story. I've been very pleased to share it with you this evening, and I would like to thank you for your attention.